the wilderness. The idea is that you have to follow the entire law if you want to live. The argument is you've been in the wilderness, but it wasn't as punishment, right? The wilderness time was to test you, right? It was pedagogical, sorry. It was to educate you, to give you an experience, to humble you. It was a lesson so that you would learn that God cares for you in the worst of circumstances. The text says things like, the Lord disciplines you the way that a parent disciplines a child. Discipline there not meaning punish, but meaning instruct. In the spy story, Israel was disobedient. They lacked faith in God's protection. So what did God do? God spent the next 40 years showing them what protection looks like. Well, it was terrible out there in the wilderness, but here you are, totally fine. Right? God kept you fine, which is another rationale for following Yahweh rather than the other gods. It's a little bit more emotional, right? Not only are you obligated because Yahweh took you out of Egypt, but Yahweh also cared for you like a parent cares for a child. And again, we can think of this sort of in treaty language ways. I conquered you, so you're obligated to me, but I've also protected you from these terrible threats. Even in this case, if it's threats that I subjected you to myself, But Moses recognizes again that the wilderness, like the Exodus from Egypt, is pedagogically useful only while it's remembered. When you are multiple generations into living in this good promised land, you might well forget. You might forget about the Exodus. You might forget about the wilderness. You might forget about the water from the rock and the manna. Right? And this is the quote that's up on the slide. You might think you're successful. You might say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth. You might think you're successful because you're just so darn good at living. But no, success comes from God, as much in the good times now as in the bad times back in the wilderness. And that's the pedagogy of the wilderness period. It was terrible, and you still survived. So you should know that, when it's good, even more so is that God taking care of you. And again, note again here at the end, the fear that forgetting God will manifest, as it always does, in apostasy, right? You're going to turn to other gods and serve them. And the fear is that you are going to, what Yahweh did for you is all in the past. And you might think that these other gods are the ones who are doing it for you now. But you're supposed to know otherwise. That's why you have to remember the wilderness and remember the Exodus. Now, starting in chapter 9, in the run-up to the law, we're getting real close to the laws themselves, the laws proper. Moses launches into one of his main themes, tying back to the beginning of the speech in the historical recollection, but still following on the humility lesson of the previous chapter, right? Don't think that you're so great that you did all this for yourself. And now Moses says, but also, don't think I'm giving this land to you because you're any good. You aren't any good. You're the most stubborn of people. Right? This whole time in the wilderness, actually, the whole time I was just talking about, the whole time that Yahweh has been taking care of you, you guys have been the worst. We started with the spies. Right? That's where Moses started his whole historical recollection. And this is the moment where Moses is going to go in and describe the golden calf, right? Really the big moment of apostasy for Deuteronomy. But D isn't describing it just because it's part of a story or it's part of the history. Right? D never says anything without a purpose. Deuteronomy is never just telling the story. There's always some reason for it. Right? That's what rhetoric is. Deuteronomy is teaching a lesson here. And the lesson has to do with disobedience. Right? The golden calf is like a literal object lesson in Israel's disobedience. And the lesson is here in these words. You have been rebellious from the day you left Egypt until now. The whole time. And in case you didn't get the point, right, after describing the sin of the golden calf in detail, which is sort of the paradigmatic example, Moses then goes on to say, right, so there was the golden calf, and also Taberah and Massah and Kivrot Ta'ava and Kadesh Barnea, right? Not just at Horeb, not just the golden calf, but the whole time. Taberah and Kivrot Ta'ava, these are the J episodes from Numbers 11, which we read a couple of weeks ago. Massah, that's the water from the rock story in Exodus 17, also from J. Kadesh Barnea, that's the spy story, which we've seen is also taken from J. In other words, what D has done here is essentially systematically gone through the entire J wilderness narrative and plucked out the stories of Israel being ungrateful or rebellious and compiled them in this chapter as proof that Israel, by its very nature, is stubborn and bad. And just to tie back a little bit to when we talked about these stories a few weeks ago, the wilderness stories, you'll remember one of the things I said is that in J, the wilderness stories are about Israel not having faith and being sort of rebellious against God, right? Is God in our midst or not? Not believing in God's providence. And in E, the stories are about fights about Moses' prophetic authority. And in P, they're fights about the priesthood. So Deuteronomy doesn't know anything about P, but it's super interesting that it doesn't have really any interest in E's stories about challenges to Moses' prophetic authority. There's no Numbers 12 in here where Aaron and Miriam go at it. Datan and Abiram are mentioned in the briefest of passing ways, but their story is not told. D is seeing exactly what we were seeing. E is about Moses. E's rebellion is about Moses' prophetic authority. The only one of E's that matters is the golden calf. J's stories are examples of Israel being rebellious and stubborn toward God. Those are the stories D wants, because those are the ones that prove D's point. You guys have been terrible the whole time. So again, we see how D is really picking and choosing and carefully reading his sources and then using them to construct his argument. Altogether, Moses' speeches here especially from chapter 5 through 11 are this really a masterful performance. A history lesson where the memories are serving to support the arguments. God rescued you. God cared for you. You may forget this when you get to your new land with its new peoples and gods, but don't forget. Don't turn away. Observe all of these laws or else.